Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy little human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's Morbid makeup video. I'm so happy we can meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this craziness today, you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or BRATTERSTEIN, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be talking about the brutal murder of Stacey Stites and the possible wrongful conviction of Rodney Reed. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter if you want. They're both BRATTERSTEIN, but no pressure. All right, now that I'm done essentially begging you to join my cult, we can get into this video now. If you are unfamiliar, in April of 1996, 19-year-old Stacey Stites was found brutally raped and murdered, and a 29-year-old man named Rodney Reed was convicted of this crime and given the death sentence. In the years since the murder, Stacey's murder, and the conviction of Rodney Reed, most of the evidence that actually convicted Rodney Reed has come into question, and the police investigation in general, the way evidence was handled and suppressed at trial, and even the possible involvement or potential cover-up in the police department that handled the investigation has left a lot of people wondering if Rodney Reed is guilty, and makes them think that at the very least he deserves a new trial. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to think here. I'm gonna try to leave my opinion out as much as I can when it comes to that. I'm just gonna deliver the information and implore you to come to your own conclusion. With that said, while I give you the information, I'm gonna be putting on a full face of makeup. If that's not your thing, that's fine. Thanks for hanging out this long. I hope you find a video that gives you all the information you want in the format that you enjoy. But if you're kind of on the fence, like, I don't know how I feel about that, maybe stick around. You may be surprised by how much you like it. Now, if you've been here before, you know I don't typically do disclosures in the beginning of my videos, but in this particular case, I feel like I should, and that's just because of the very sensitive topics we're going to be discussing that involve sexual assault, other victims, things of that nature. So I am going to do a disclosure, and that is this. I, of course, mean no disrespect to anyone involved in this case, any victims. If you've been here before, you know, my friends know that I come into these videos with nothing but respect, compassion, and just like heartache for all victims in the cases that we cover. Like, I think that that's pretty clear. You guys are always saying that you see that. Now, this is a very controversial case. Tensions are high and opinions are typically strong. And since YouTube is a public platform, we've discussed this. Anybody can stumble in here, not know me, and take what I say differently than it's intended. So I just want it to be known here that of course I mean no disrespect. And with that said, I will be as delicate as possible while discussing some of the most horrible things that you can imagine. So now, with all of that out of the way, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the brutal murder of Stacey Stites and the possible wrongful conviction of Rodney Reed. On April 23rd, 1996 at about 3 p.m., police received a call that a body had been discovered in some bushes near the side of a road in Bastrop, Texas. This body was the body of a female. She was dressed in just jeans and a bra. She was badly beaten and she was partially burned. And this was the body of 19-year-old Stacey Stites. Stacey Stites was a beautiful, popular, well-liked girl. She was the youngest of 5 children and was the sort of miracle to her family because when her mother found out that she was pregnant with her, she was actually struggling with cancer, and yet still made the selfless choice of foregoing treatments and medicine to ensure that Stacey was a healthy baby. From the moment Stacey could walk and talk, she was unstoppable. She was always on the move and always energetic, and she was even given the childhood nickname of White Tornado. She was the first to go up and talk to anyone and was everyone's friend. She was described as actual sunshine. She was fun and she was funny and she was the one to try to make everyone laugh, and in the best way possible. She didn't take life or herself too seriously. She graduated from Smithville High School in 1995 despite actually getting pregnant at the young age of 15. You see, once her father had passed away when she was a teenager, she sort of went through a bit of a mental shift and just lost herself a bit. and it was shortly after this that she became pregnant. She made the difficult decision to not keep the baby girl, and instead this baby was adopted by a couple at Stacey's church in an open adoption. It was kept open because Stacey wanted to stay in her daughter's life over the years, which is a very strong and brave and difficult decision for anyone to make. Like, I can't imagine giving a child up for adoption and then still seeing the baby often. Like, it seems like it would rip open the wound just constantly. While in high school, Stacey had lots of friends. She participated in a bunch of different sports. She was a very active person, and she was even in the ROTC, which I was in the ROTC, and the ROTC. And once she graduated high school, unlike a lot of kids who were just like really, really quick to move out of her parents' house, Stacey did not. She instead moved with her mother to the neighboring town of Bastrop, Texas, less than a 20-minute drive away from her hometown. Once she settled in, she got a job at a grocery store, and this is the same job where a coworker would later realize she was missing and get concerned. Her and her mother did eventually make the final move to Giddings, Texas, and she would often make the 30-minute commute from her home to her job in Bastrop, Texas at the grocery store. I believe it was in Giddings, Texas, where Stacey met the man who would one day be who would quickly become her fiance, a man named Jimmy Fennell. He, at the time that they met, was a security guard, but in the short time that they were together, he had actually become a police officer, and the two met in 1995 at a sort of music festival where Jimmy was working security, and very quickly the two were into each other, fell in love, got engaged all within the span of a year, and Jimmy, Stacey, and Stacey's mother, Carol, actually all moved together into the same apartment complex. Jimmy and Stacey were on the top floor, and Stacey's mother, I believe, was living in the apartment directly below them, but to either the right or the left. Like, they described it as catty corner below Stacey and Jimmy. I think it's sweet that Stacey and her mother were so close that they wanted to actually live right next to each other, because this is when Stacey was 19 years old. And I don't know about you, but when I was 19 years old, I did not want to live next to my mother. Like, I love her now, but when I was 19, I was an asshole, a total asshole. Stacey's family loved Jimmy when they met him. They thought that the two of them were a really good match for each other. They were both involved in the church. They both had similar goals and similar values. And though Stacey was more of a free spirit and Jimmy was definitely more conservative, they seemed to balance each other out and be just a good, solid yin and yang match. The day that Stacey was murdered, she had driven herself to work. Now, apparently the day before, Jimmy and she had discussed that he would actually drive her to work. I guess she didn't have her own vehicle, so he would drive her in his truck. And I guess the night before, they had decided that instead of doing that, so that Jimmy could kind of get some more sleep, sleep in, obviously, she was going to drive herself to work in his truck, and he'd get a ride to work or to pick her up at her work later. I hope that made sense. It took me several times to try to get that sentence out. Anyway, she left for work super early. Her shift started, I think, at like 3:30 in the morning, so it was incredibly early, and she ended up never showing up to work that day. And at first, they were like, maybe she's just late, maybe she overslept. They kind of gave it some time, but after several hours of Stacey not showing up, this was very weird for her. She was never the one to be a no-call, no-show. That just wasn't who she was as a person. So one of her coworkers who was concerned ended up calling Stacey's mother, Carol. Carol was stunned because she had actually heard her daughter leaving for her shift at work that morning because she lived right below her, and she was used to the sounds of her daughter getting ready and her routine, because apparently this was Stacey's normal shift, which, man, that sounds like a rough shift, but I guess she did it well, and she was even taking additional shifts to make some more money because Jimmy and her were to be married just 18 days after her murder. So Carol freaked out, and she called Jimmy, who said he had been sleeping at the time that the call came in, and she was just like, Stacey is missing. And she said that he freaked out and then he was like, okay, I'll be right down. He rushed downstairs. He got the keys to her car because Stacey had taken his truck, and he went out and started looking for Stacey. And while he did this, Stacey's mother and her sisters went and made flyers and went door to door seeing if anybody had seen anything or if anyone knew anything. So right away, Jimmy called into police and he reported Stacey missing, and he also gave the license plate number of his truck so that police could immediately be on the lookout. So they were onto this case pretty quickly after Stacey was first noticed to be missing. Jimmy's truck ended up being discovered prior to Stacey's body being found, and it was parked at Bastrop High School, which was pretty close to where her body would eventually be discovered. And Apparently this truck was actually found earlier in the morning. I think the report said it was at like 5:30 in the morning. The truck was actually found by a police officer, and the cop had seen it sitting in the parking lot and had actually ran the plates to see if anything came up, to see if there was anything suspicious. But since nothing did come up, because at the time Stacey wasn't reported missing, they went about their business and just left the truck there. And initially I was like, that's kind of weird. Why would he just run these plates randomly? But then I thought about it and I'm like, it's really early in the morning. This is the only vehicle parked at this high school. This is a small town. It probably just stuck out to him as odd. So I don't know why I felt the need to mention that, but I did. Because that is the thought process my brain had. It's like, why was this cop so quick to look into it? But so once the truck was found, Jimmy was actually brought in by police to look at the truck and see if anything looked amiss. And supposedly he wasn't allowed to like touch anything in the truck. Just look in and visually inspect, but still he was brought in around evidence. And I just thought that was kind of weird. Because I mean, if a woman goes missing, I guess they might not have been treating this immediately as a crime or a homicide, but you would think that they'd immediately be suspecting the husband, because it's, say it with me, almost always the husband, right? But anyway, inside the vehicle, it's found that there is one of Stacey's shoes. And outside the truck, there is a piece of a belt that Jimmy identified as belonging to Stacey. On top of that, the seat in the car, like the driver's seat, was reclined pretty far back and pulled pretty far back from the steering wheel, but the seatbelt was buckled, so it looked like maybe somebody taller had driven her vehicle, and that's why the seat was back, but the seatbelt was buckled, which is weird to me, and I don't really understand why that would be. And I still, after looking at everything, can't figure out why that would be. Additionally, inside the car on the floorboard was one of Stacey's earrings, and next to it there was some like white mucusy stuff on the floorboard of the car, and my first thought was semen, but I guess we don't know what this is because it was never tested. Now, I do remember actually, like years ago, maybe like 2 years ago, Stephanie Harlow, who's another YouTuber, true crime YouTuber, I'm sure you've heard of her. She covered this case. And I heard it, and I watched her video on it forever ago because I always watch Stephanie Harlow's videos. And I remember her talking about this, and I remember her saying that she had a theory, or there was a theory, I don't remember if it was her theory specifically, but she discussed a theory where perhaps Stacey had been killed elsewhere, and then her body was placed on the floorboard of this truck, and that's how her earring got there, and that her body was like expelling, the mucus was her body expelling fluids, and that could explain why it was there, which I thought was an interesting theory. Again, when I first read about this mucus, I thought maybe it was a type of semen, but I thought that was a good theory, so I wanted to mention it because I remember her saying that. But either way, we don't know because it wasn't tested. The vehicle was dusted for fingerprints, which is to be expected, and the only fingerprints found inside the vehicle belonged to Jimmy and to Stacey, which didn't really lead them in any direction, and the truck was pretty quickly returned back to Jimmy. I believe it was within a week. It was already given back to him. And get this, Jimmy immediately traded this truck in, which I think he did it like the day after he got it back, which I think is odd, especially because at this point an arrest hadn't even been made. And as a normal person, I would think that you would want to keep this car as evidence in case they needed to re-look into it. I could see not wanting to have it because it's got these bad memories, but I can also see that it seems more likely that somebody would hold on to it just in case it's necessary, and especially because Jimmy was a cop, and this was the last place his murdered fiance was known to be, but yet he still like immediately traded it in, and I found that to be weird. Moving on, after going to the police and checking that truck with them, Jimmy went back to the apartment complex to be with Carol while they waited to find out what happened to Stacey. It was later that same afternoon that at about 3 p.m. Stacey's body was found, and so what happened was there was this man who was literally walking through the fields picking wildflowers for his wife, which is the most wholesome thing I've ever heard, when he stumbled upon something that I'm sure absolutely ruined him. Stacey was found on the ground lying on her back in just her jeans that she had been wearing that day and her black bra. On one foot was a shoe, and on the other foot was just a sock, and the sock was clean, so it was clear she hadn't walked herself out there. The zipper on her jeans was broken, and it was clear that she looked to have been redressed from the waist down based on the condition of her underwear. And something that was really weird but definitely noteworthy is that her fingernails on her hands were cut really short and really jaggedly. It didn't look like the way a woman would have cut her own nails, which I don't know about you, but the way that I cut my nails versus the way my husband cuts his nails are drastically different. Near Stacey's body, they found a piece of belt that matched the piece of belt that was found at the truck at the high school. They also found her shirt and her name tag for work. Stacey had red marks on her neck that matched the belt that was found in both scenes. She also had scratch marks and scrapes on her legs, her arms, her back, and she even had a mark on her from where a cigarette had been put out on her body after death, which it is a blessing that I read that this was done after death. So I'm glad she didn't have to feel that. But man, there really has to be some hate in you to look at a dead woman and put a cigarette out on her body. Like, I don't know, something about that really just like irked me. It was determined that Stacey had been sodomized and vaginally raped prior to being strangled to death with her own belt, and semen was found inside of her body. Her poor family, dude, was devastated. Just a couple of days prior to her death, they had thrown her like a bridal shower, a wedding shower, and all the like gifts and stuff were still in her mom's like front room of her house. And now, instead of celebrating Stacey's wedding, they were going to be mourning her at her funeral, and she was actually buried in her wedding dress that she had been working so hard to save up for. Police really went in hard trying to find out what happened to Stacey, because like, you don't mess with a cop's family, asshole. And there was even a $50,000 reward put up for any information that could lead to the killer. And the police brought in like every single man who had any relation at all to Stacey. They took DNA swabs from all of them, and all of them came back negative. So even though Jimmy was a fellow cop, he was police's first main suspect because, you know, statistically, he would be the one that would be most likely to murder Stacey. It's always the partner. Not always, but you know what I mean. They say it's always the partner. So that's the first place they're going to look. So they do ask him, like, standard procedure, what did you guys do the night before she died? How were things? He said that their relationship was really good, that the night before she died, they had just been hanging out, they'd been talking, they took a shower together, and then she went to bed early because she had that really early shift, and he stayed up watching TV late into the hours of the night. You know what I'm trying to say there. So Jimmy said it was just a totally normal night, and I believe Jimmy was given 2 different lie detector tests, and he did show deception on both tests, and at first police were kind of like, huh, maybe we've got something here. What is this? Deception, right? But when they tested Jimmy's DNA against the semen found in Stacey's body, because remember there was semen found, he was not a match. And in addition to that, that wasn't the only thing that excluded him. That did end up excluding him a little bit. They actually didn't. They did continue looking at him. They never stopped looking at him until they got to their main suspect, the guy, Rodney Reed, who was convicted of this murder. But anyway, another thing that made them think that Jimmy may not have been guilty is the fact that they lived in Giddings, and Stacey worked in Bastrop, which was 30 minutes away about, right? She took the truck. That was the only vehicle. So how could he have gone there and killed her? How would he have gotten home? The truck was left there. And he was home at 6:30 to take that phone call from Carol. So they were like, I guess he has no friends who could ever pick him up or whatever. They just were like, this just seems unlikely. A plus B does not seem to equal C here. 6 months after Stacey's murder, the officers investigating her death came upon a lucky break when they were introduced to a man named Rodney Reed. Rodney Reed was first put on investigators' radar in reference to Stacey's case when he was arrested for the kidnapping, attempted rape, and threat of murder to a 19-year-old girl named Linda. So when police heard this story, heard what he did, they were like, huh, this sounds very similar to Stacey Stites' case, and they decided that they would very much like to have a conversation with him. Additionally, Rodney stuck out to police as a possible suspect for Stacey's murder for a couple of other reasons as well. One was proximity. Rodney lived very close to where both the truck and Stacey's body were inevitably found. Two was that Rodney was known to often be walking around late at night in the general area that Stacey's body was found. And three was that Rodney had actually been suspected to be the perpetrator of several other sexual assault cases, not just the one against Linda. And though he had not been convicted of these cases, they were ongoing. Several of them were still ongoing, and he was a suspect in some that were already completed. So reasonably, police are very interested in having a conversation with Rodney. So they question him. And first they ask him, like, do you know Stacey Stites? Have you ever met her? Do you know anything about her? And he claimed at first to not know her at all, to know nothing about her. Never heard that girl's name in my life. Which later he changes the story, but as you know, lying or changing your story to police is a really bad way to get started. And here's the thing. Here's the kicker. Police had Rodney's DNA on file due to the prior sexual assault allegations. And they took this DNA and they tested it against the DNA, the semen found in Stacey's body. And Rodney Reed was a match for the semen found in Stacey Stites' body. Now, about the prior sexual assault cases against Rodney Reed. I don't want to just gloss over them quickly. I do want to tell you what they were because in looking into them further, I do believe that they are relevant to the storyline here. In addition to the assaults against 19-year-old Linda, who we discussed previously, there were also 5 other allegations of sexual assault against Rodney Reed. The first being of a 19-year-old girl named Connie, who had been forced into her bedroom, beaten, and raped repeatedly. When Rodney Reed was questioned about this, he said that he knew Connie, but that they had never been intimate. When he was pressed further because his DNA was found on her body, he pivoted and said that he did know her, that they had had sex, but that it was consensual. Next was a 12-year-old girl named Angela, who had been home alone when somebody came into her home, blindfolded her, gagged her, and raped her vaginally, anally, and orally while beating her repeatedly in the head and calling her vulgar names. And Rodney Reed's DNA was consistent with her rape kit. Next was a woman named Lucy, who was actually in a long-term relationship with Rodney Reed and was the mother of his 2 children. She says over the course of their relationship, he continuously beat her and raped her, sometimes when she was pregnant and at least once in front of their 2 children. Next, he was in a relationship with another woman. This was a mentally disabled woman named Caroline, who claimed that Rodney beat her, called her vulgar names, and anally raped her. Her DNA kit was consistent with Rodney Reed. And this is actually the DNA that was used to test against Stacey Stites' the semen found inside of Stacey Stites, which effectively linked him to Stacey Stites' murder. And last, 6 months before the murder of Stacey Stites, a woman named Vivian was raped underneath a train trestle, and while she was being raped, she begged for her life, and her rapist laughed in her face. A rape kit produced DNA that was consistent with Rodney Reed. Now, I know that that is a lot of information to take in, and that might immediately bias you against Rodney Reed, and I understand that, but there is something to be taken away from this, and that is that there are a lot of bad men in this world, and no one is saying that Rodney Reed is not a bad man. He very well may be a bad man, but there's evidence to suggest that he may not be the bad man who killed Stacey. Though he was not convicted of these assaults, the sheer number of them and the DNA evidence can't be ignored, and I'm not going to ignore that. Even if you tried to say that all of these assaults were consensual, when it comes to the 12-year-old girl, it clearly was not. So again, no one's saying, I'm not saying, that Rodney Reed is not a bad man. But if you keep listening, there is evidence that may convince you that he is not the bad man who did this. And if he is not, that means that there is a horrible man who is still free today. And therein lies the issue. So moving forward, after Rodney Reed's DNA was linked to Stacey, police were like, okay, so listen. If you didn't know her at all, never met her, never heard her name before, how exactly did your semen end up inside of her then? And this is when he pivoted and he said, okay, I did know her. We were actually having a sexual relationship. We were having an affair and we had sex just 2 days prior to her being killed. Now, this pivot normally would seem very, very suspicious, but I do think it's worth noting where we are in terms of location and time when this happened. This was 1996 in Texas. This is the same state that 2 years later, James Byrd Jr. would be murdered in a modern day lynching, what is described as a modern day lynching. And in this state, at this time, it was only after James Byrd Jr.'s murder that a cemetery in his area was desegregated. So when you look at those factors, it makes sense as to why a black man, if he was having an affair with a white woman who was also engaged to a police officer, may not be forthcoming with that information for fear of repercussions, especially when that woman ended up murdered. I'm not saying that that is what he did. I'm saying that if you think about it in that way, it makes sense that if he was having an affair with her, she ended up murdered and he had nothing to do with it, why he may not be forthcoming with the information that they were having an affair at all when initially asked if he knew her. Again, though, with all of that said, it is also worth noting that based on the prior sexual assault cases, it does appear that Rodney Reed does claim to not know women that he has been accused of sexually assaulting, not knowing them at all, until being presented with physical evidence that ties him to these women, and then claiming that the sex was consensual. Rodney then told police that he and Stacey had started their affair about 6 months earlier, that the two just really hit it off. They weren't in love. It wasn't, that sort of thing. It was all physical because he was with someone and she was with someone, but that the two of them would they'd meet at his mother's house or they'd meet at public parks late at night, and this is where they would have their physical affairs. Rodney also told police that he and Stacey had been keeping it a secret because of, one, the way the community might respond to their relationship due to their race, and two, because of who Stacey was engaged to. Rodney Reed was arrested in April of 1997, almost a year exactly after Stacey Stites' murder. His family did meet with an attorney, but they weren't able to afford him, so he was given a public defender. And they essentially had virtually no time to actually prepare for trial. I believe, God, what did the doc say? I believe they only had like 2 months to prepare for a trial that had been investigated for about a year. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the DNA that was found inside of Stacey. Obviously, their case against Rodney relied heavily on that. And the problem for the defense is that a medical examiner was brought in and testified that Rodney's account of having sex with Stacey 2 days prior to her being killed would not account for the semen that was inside of her body at the time of death, because due to the semen's condition that was inside of her and the way it had degraded, it couldn't have been older than a day old. And since Stacey had been sexually assaulted at the time of her murder, 1 + 2, whoever the semen belonged to that was inside of her was the one who raped and killed her. The theory was essentially that Stacey had been driving to work, Rodney had flagged her down, somehow gotten into her car, had forced her to drive to the school, raped her, and killed her. But for the defense, there were several witnesses who actually claimed to know that Rodney had been having an affair with Stacey. Of these people were Rodney's mother, who claimed that she knew he was having an affair with a cop's wife, or a cop's fiance, a cop's girlfriend, and had told her son that he needed to be careful and not be messing around with women who are married, and definitely not women who are married to cops. And another friend, a friend I believe it was, of Rodney's, a man named Chris, said that not only did he know that the two were having an affair, but he could actually give Rodney an alibi for that night, saying that the two had been working at a construction site, I believe it was, and then had spent most of the night together that Stacey was killed. None of these witnesses were heard at Rodney's trial. None of them were brought in to testify because the defense thought that they wouldn't be good witnesses, that the jury would not find them to be trustworthy or reliable because many of them had criminal records. Here's the thing though, and I understand that thought process, that it would make Rodney look bad to associate with so many criminals, but it wasn't like a secret that Rodney had a criminal past. And one of these witnesses could literally corroborate his alibi. So whether they're trustworthy or not, I think maybe that should have been for the jury to decide, and that they should have at least been heard. That's my opinion on that one. On May 29th, 1998, after 4 hours of deliberation, Rodney Reed was found guilty, and he was subsequently given the death sentence by an all-white jury. I do feel like someone is going to say, like, why does it matter that the jury was white? Why is that even worth mentioning? And it's because you are supposed to be judged by a jury of your peers. And I wouldn't say that an entirely white jury ever for a black man would be a jury of his peers. Definitely not in this time. So, but that's an opinion. But it definitely doesn't seem, if you really think about it constructively and take your emotions out of it, that is a jury of his peers. During Rodney Reed's punishment hearing, the hearing that ended up giving him the death penalty, the victims of the sexual assault cases that were alleged against him, that he had not yet been convicted of, were allowed to give impact statements. And I can't decide how I feel about this because he was not convicted of these crimes, I don't know if I feel it's appropriate, I guess you could say, especially considering the types of things that are excluded at trials. For example, in the case that I covered, man, I don't know how long ago it'll be once this gets uploaded, but Rodney Alcala's case, another Rodney, I didn't even realize that, but at Rodney Alcala's case, he won an appeal on his conviction because at his trial, his history of sexually assaulting and attempting to murder an 8-year-old was, that was heard at his trial. And that was seen as a violation of his rights when he was being tried for later murdering a 12-year-old. So I don't see how it's appropriate for victims of cases that he hadn't even been prosecuted for yet to testify at his punishment phase, when in some cases that kind of stuff's not allowed at all. Now, granted, this was the punishment phase and not the actual trial, and the rules are different. I just don't know if I feel it's appropriate, and I thought it was worth mentioning. Again, there's no disrespect to those victims coming from here because what happened to them is absolutely horrible. I'm just more questioning our system in general, and if I think that that's an appropriate thing if he hasn't been convicted of them yet. If that makes sense. I hope it makes sense, but we'll see. Rodney Reed was set to be executed by the state of Texas on November 20th, 2019, but he actually did receive a stay of execution. Now, Rodney's defense team has filed several appeals in his case, and the Innocence Project has even taken on Rodney's case to try to get new eyes on it, additional DNA testing, just kind of get a fresh and perhaps less biased look at this case. The aim of this is to get his conviction overturned, or alternatively, at least get him a new trial. And we're now going to discuss why people think that he should be entitled to this. First, there was suppression of evidence at Rodney Reed's murder trial, which is a big no-no. All evidence is supposed to go to the defense and to the prosecution so that both of them can build strong and fair cases. Of this evidence that was suppressed and not given over to the defense was the fact that 2 beer cans were found near where Stacey's body was discovered. And when these beer cans were tested for DNA, DNA came back that matched to 2 men and to 1 woman. The 2 men were David Hall and Ed Salmela, who were both police officers and friends of Jimmy, Stacey's fiance. And the female DNA came back as a match to Stacey herself. And when you start to think about that for too long, it opens up a whole new can of worms, in my opinion. It really gets the wheels turning. And if that's not weird enough, Ed Salmela, one of the officers whose DNA matched on the beer can, was also one of the first officers on the scene when Stacey's truck was found, Jimmy's truck was found. And this is going to be like, I'm sorry, what? Just 4 months after Stacey's murder, Ed Salmela committed suicide, which is already odd. But some people actually think that it wasn't suicide, among other reasons, one of which is that he was right-handed and he was shot in his left temple, which leads some people to believe, I believe even his own brother doesn't think that he killed himself, if I remember correctly, but don't quote me. I'm 95% sure I read that. But it is worth noting that his doctor at the time did say that he was expressing suicidal thoughts, but it's just one of those things that can get your conspiracy theory wheels moving. Additionally, in general, this murder the investigation wasn't handled properly at all. The police never searched the apartment that Stacey and Jimmy shared, even though this was the last place that she was known to be seen alive. They also returned the truck to Jimmy almost immediately, and I cannot imagine that, first off, he was a suspect at the time they returned the truck to him. And that just seems incredibly weird. And I can't imagine that they had had enough time to properly process the truck before giving it back to him. But that's just my opinion. I could be wrong on that. It was fingerprinted, so obviously they did do some investigating in this truck. But when it was fingerprinted, the only fingerprints found belonged to Jimmy and Stacey, right? None belonged to Rodney. Now, if he, as the theory goes, flagged her down and got in to her truck, how would he be able to do that without leaving any fingerprints in that truck? None. Not a single fingerprint. And maybe there was his DNA in there. If he did it, maybe there was, but it wasn't processed properly. So how would we ever know? But I think the fact that his fingerprints weren't found in it is definitely noteworthy. At the crime scene, investigators put a blanket over Stacey's body to, protect her decency. But that is a big no-no. That is a one-way ticket to contamination station. And speaking of contamination, the officers who were investigating the scene were touching her body, touching evidence without changing gloves, and sometimes without even wearing any gloves. They even started to undress Stacey at the crime scene, which is super weird, a big no-no, not standard protocol, and seems to be counterproductive to respecting her decency, which is what that blanket was meant to accomplish. It also took way longer for Stacey's body to get to the coroner's office than it should have and than is typical. And the photos that police took of her body at the crime scene, of her injuries and things like that, didn't match the photos that the coroner ended up taking once she finally arrived at the coroner's office. It looked like new bruises and new markings had started to show up. And I guess this could make sense, though, because of how long it took to transport her body because of decomp and all that. Now, a big issue that stands out to me when it comes to whether or not they investigated thoroughly is that the belt that was determined to be the murder weapon, the belt that was pulled with such force to kill Stacey that the belt ripped in half. Okay? This has never been tested for DNA. Ever. And if you look at this belt, it is a black braided belt. It's like a leather braided belt. There are so many places, tons of nooks and crannies where skin cells could absolutely be from the force it would have taken to kill her and rip this belt. And it's never been tested. That is crazy. Additionally, there are inconsistencies regarding the condition of Stacey's body when she was found. Now, first, Stacey had fixed lividity in the front of her body, like face, body, front, like she had been laying on her stomach. So basically, the way this works, from how I understand it, once you die, if you are left laying in a certain position for a prolonged period of time, the blood in your body starts to pool to whatever position you're laying at. So it starts to sink and pool in the body, and it leaves a bluish, purplish, kind of like a bruise, but it's a lot bigger, to show that your body's been laying in a certain position for a certain amount of time because your blood's not flowing, it's just all sinking to the bottom. This takes 4 to 6 hours to become fixed, where it's just the bruise is there, you can move me now, the bruise is still going to be there. When Stacey was found, she was on her back, which would mean, based on the science there, that prior to being placed in that field of flowers, she was laying on the front of her body for several hours after death. Now, if that's true, that would put her time of death later in the night, which would have her being at home, and which would take Rodney Reed out of the picture altogether. On top of that, the medical examiner at Rodney's trial said that the semen inside of Stacey, because of the way that it had decomposed, had to have been less than a day old. So Rodney's account of having sex with her 2 days prior would not account for the semen. The same medical examiner has since come out and said that their initial findings were incorrect and that semen could very well be older than 1 day old. The medical examiner also changed the time of death that was initially given, stating that when the time of death was given, it was just an estimate, and if they had known that it was going to be used at trial, they would have said not to, because he hadn't put enough time into determining the time of death. And has since said, I believe the initial time of death was 3 a.m., give or take 4 hours. They changed the time of death, saying that it could have been earlier, which again would have had Stacey at home. Now, following that trail of thought, many people who have looked into this case think that Rodney Reed is innocent, and it was actually Stacey's fiance, Jimmy Finnell, that is responsible for her murder. In 2007, Jimmy Finnell was convicted and sentenced to 10 years for kidnapping and raping a woman. He did this while on the clock. He had responded to a domestic dispute. The man was taken into custody, and the woman wanted to go and be with the man. Jimmy, being the only one left on the scene, agreed to take her there. He then used his position of power to rape this vulnerable woman and threatened to kill her if she ever opened her mouth. But she did open her mouth. She immediately called the police, and what's really messed up is when she called the police, one of the officers who responded to her call was Jimmy Finnell, and I heard her 911 call because she stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, and when he pulled up, she's like, oh my God, that's him, like she freaked out, and it gives me chills. If you listen to that 911 call, there's a documentary on YouTube called Stacey Stites, The Girl in the Pines. I'll link it below. I'll try to remember to link it below. Let me write this down. Anyways, sorry, she did report it. He did get convicted, and because of her coming out and speaking about what he had done to her, it opened the floodgates for several women to come out and say that Jimmy Finnell had used his position of power to sexually assault them. He was arrested, he was convicted, he did his 10 years, and he was released in 2017. But before Jimmy was released, several people who had been close to Jimmy before and had been quiet after Stacey was murdered got a little more vocal about their suspicions of Jimmy, about things they knew about Jimmy and the murder, and now just felt comfortable expressing these things since he was behind bars and no longer a threat. There was no more threat of retaliation in their minds, or at least less of one. One of Jimmy's friends came out and said that Jimmy had lied when he was questioned by police, and that his alibi of being home with Stacey was untrue. He says instead Jimmy had been out drinking with friends. One of these friends being David Hall, the officer whose DNA was on the beer cans found at Stacey's crime scene. It is worth noting that David Hall did have an alibi, but his alibi was that he was at home with his wife. So, I think that's worth noting. Additionally, while in jail, allegedly, Jimmy confessed to a fellow inmate that he had murdered his wife for sleeping with a black man. Could he have made this confession just to sound harder in prison? Maybe. I believe the man that he confessed this to, allegedly, was a white supremacist, so maybe he was just trying to impress a Nazi fuck who shared his ideas on black human beings. That's definitely possible. But it's also hard to tell if this person is being honest with saying that Jimmy confessed this at all. That's one of those things that you just kind of have to keep in mind is, what are the motivations of the people who are now coming out giving statements? It has been so much time, and though people could have just been waiting because they're scared of retaliation, this guy was a cop, you do also have to consider this is a very high profile case now, And it is not at all uncommon for people to just want to insert themselves in something that's big. So keep that in mind as well. Keep everything in mind that I say, but come to your own conclusions. And back to Jimmy. It's said that Jimmy was known for being kind of a dick, and that allegedly he was very overpowering and controlling of women, particularly Stacey. And people who knew Stacey said that the relationship wasn't as strong or good as Jimmy made it seem, that Stacey seemed to be really excited about the wedding, about a wedding, but not so much excitement towards Jimmy himself. And that Stacey may have been noticing things recently that were just kind of upsetting her, that she had to go and she had to work so hard all the time just to come home and make sure that the house and their lives were kept to just the way that Jimmy wanted it, and it may have been more than she bargained for as a free-spirited 19-year-old. And along with the idea that he was controlling, apparently, according to somebody who came out later, Jimmy had also threatened to murder Stacey before, saying that if she was ever to cheat on him or ever to step out on him, he would kill her, and that the worst thing she could ever do to him would be to have an affair with a black man. And that does seem to be incredibly specific to come out after the fact, but it is worth noting that, again, Jimmy was a police officer, and these statements came out once he was incarcerated, I believe, where there wouldn't be retaliation. But again, you have to wonder what the motivations are behind the people that are now saying it out of nowhere. And now, with all of that information given, I toss it to you. Do you think Rodney Reed is guilty of murdering Stacey Stites? Additionally, with all of your feelings about who Rodney may have been as a person set aside, do you think he got a fair trial? I am not telling you how to feel. I am giving you the information and asking you to come to your own conclusion and use your own judgment. I, for one, am on the fence regarding his guilt. I do not think there was enough evidence, based on what I've seen, to convict him beyond a reasonable doubt. But again, with that said, I'm not convinced he's innocent. And I know that there's this emotional response where you want to be like, well, you know what? Fuck him. If he's guilty, who cares if he got a fair trial? Let him fry, right? With anybody who commits a murder. But the problem with that is a very slippery slope. Our justice system is designed in a way where you're supposed to be able to get a fair trial. And by just being like, who cares if the trial was fair, that's how you get into the territory of innocent people getting convicted and innocent people getting executed. I think it's very dangerous for police to put on blinders, and it does seem like they did that in this case. It doesn't appear that they looked thoroughly enough into Jimmy and his friends, and I do get that could be because he's a fellow cop, but that's not okay. One bad apple spoils the bunch, you know what I'm saying? And I cannot get it out of my head. It's so weird that two of his friends, who are also cops, had their DNA on the beer cans found at the crime scene, and that Stacey's DNA was on that as well. I can't get that out of my head. That can't be explained to me, and it hasn't been explained. It just really gets my wheels turning, and then you add the fact that one of these two men has since killed himself. It just doesn't sit quite right, and I think it should have been at least investigated more thoroughly, in my opinion. I feel so horrible for Stacey's family, because not only did they have to sit back and lose a loved one, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother, right? But they had to sit back and watch her name fade from public view, go to the back burner, while the man convicted of her murder, Rodney Reed's name, was plastered all over the headlines. Now, I do understand why it's happening, and if he is innocent, damn. But I can also sympathize with them and how hard it must be to see her essentially forgotten in all of this. Especially because they do believe that Rodney Reed murdered Stacey. They're convinced that the right man's been convicted. So for them, it just feels like everyone's trying to defend a guilty man. And they've just been through a lot. There was a ripple effect from Stacey's death through their family. And just 9 months before the trial started, Stacey's brother killed himself because he couldn't deal with the loss of his sister and how it happened. So this family has just lost a lot. But that, my friends, is the story of the murder of Stacey Stites. Now, I know I just gave you a lot of information, and that's even a condensed version. There's so much to learn about this case. I will link some court documents down below. I will link the documentary I watched down below so that you can kind of come to your own conclusion if you want to. But I'm very curious as to what you think here. I know this is a very polarizing case. Do you think Rodney Reed is guilty? Do you think that it could have instead been her husband, Jimmy Fennell? Or do you have a complete alternative theory that you would like to present? Obviously, respectfully, because you never know if her family's alive. They could easily see this. I've had it happen before, so please be respectful, but let me know down below what you think happened. Because I am genuinely curious what most people think, because I thought going into this, when I knew the Cliff Notes version of this case, I had an opinion. But now that I've done a deep dive, I'm really not so sure. But overall, I do not think Rodney Reed was given a fair trial, and I don't think the investigation was handled properly. And if he is guilty and the police screwed this up so badly to the point that people are questioning it this much, that's a huge mistake on their part. That puts a lot of people, Stacey's family and Rodney's family, through more heartbreak than was necessary, and that's inexcusable. Don't fudge the numbers, because someone may want you to show your work. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope that you found it interesting and informative, and that it gave you all the information you could want when looking into this case. And of course, I want to thank you for remembering Stacey with me today, because based on everything that I've read and everything that I've watched and everything that I've seen, Stacey seemed like a beautiful, wonderful, happy person. She just seemed like a strong and loving woman who deserves to be remembered and not lost in the shuffle, because at the end of the day, she is the one that was brutally disrespected and murdered. She is the one who will never get to see her family again. She'll never get to see how her daughter turned out. She'll never get the opportunity to get older and get married and have a child of her own. She'll never get that chance. And her mother said of Stacey, and I quote here, "Stacey was a human. All she wanted to do was get married and have a baby." And that's just incredibly tragic, so I urge you all to remember the name Stacey Stites. I know that was a lot, but please let me know of any cases you'd like to see me cover down below. As you know, I have a very long list of cases, and every time you leave a suggestion, I put your name down next to it so I can give you a shout out if I cover the case, because I know you're filled with good taste and good ideas, otherwise you would not be here. Of course, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell. I put out a new video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. Speaking of which, if you want to hang out more consistently, all of my social media will be listed down below in case you want to hang out. I got Instagram, I got Twitter, I got a Facebook page, and I got a Facebook group. And it's all listed down there for your convenience, along with the makeup I use, the earrings, the nail polish, and also some additional true crime channels that you may want to check out if you want more people to binge. And with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday. And I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.